Today's story is again written by David Kossoff, and it's Rufus's story. It's a difficult story based around the events of Good Friday. Rufus is now a retired soldier. Here's Rufus's story. This little village is a nice place to live. People in the main mind their own business. A man earns his living, does his job, is left alone. I'm a sort of celebrity for something I'm so ashamed of. For something I'd rather forget, and the village knows it, so they don't mention it. We're all Christians in the village now, me too. But 20 years ago, when they crucified Jesus, nobody was. Well, there wasn't such a thing, I suppose. I was told that you went to hear him and he gave you a sort of simple way of looking at things, food for thought. It was after he were dead that the disciples really began to work at making what he'd said into a religion. Terrible death he had. People say he knew what was going to happen, that it was all there in the scriptures, that he was a prophecy come true. Well, maybe. But I'm sure there was nothing in the scriptures about how we dressed him up and made fun of him and how we jeered him and insulted him. All right, soldiers can get rough, especially with a convicted lawbreaker, but we were really rough. I wish to God I could say I hadn't joined in, but I did. I don't know who first thought of dressing Jesus up to look like a king, but it kind of seemed funny at the time. None of our platoon was in the sort of trial they gave him. All we knew was that he were a troublemaker who'd gone round saying that he were king of the Jews. We knew very little. We were just a Roman garrison. Our orders came from Pilate, Pontius Pilate. The orders were clear. A scourging and then crucify with two other criminals. Now, not many people have ever seen a Roman punishment scourge. It's one of the worst whips ever invented. It can tear a man apart. It's designed to break the skin, wrap round and tear. I've been asked why scourge a man who's going to be killed the same morning. Well, it wasn't the first time. And Pilate were hard. Also, he were fed up with the old business. I didn't do the whipping. That were a great big sergeant from Syria who did that. But it were me who put the robe on. One of the lads found it somewhere, a purple piece of material, to make Jesus look like a king. When we put him on him, he looked more like a corpse. He were naked, and that sergeant knew his job. Jesus could hardly stand. His back were like raw meat. I often dream of it. One of the boys had made a crown of twisted together thorn stalks and forced it down on Jesus' head. And then we stood him on a vegetable basket and marched round and bowed and saluted and shouted in his face. And when his head dropped, we slapped it back up again. We gave him a big onion for an orb and a twig for a sceptre, and we spat at him and laughed till we were weak, till we cried. I've cried many times since, in my sleep mostly. I can't say that the shame began right away. It didn't. As a soldier, you do many things that you wouldn't do in civilian life, but out of the service, by yourself, with time to look back, you see things different. About 8 years ago, when I'd been demobbed for just over a year, I met Peter, the fisherman, who made me a Christian. I were in a bad way. And I told him all about that night and about my shame, and Peter listened and then said, I know about shame. On that night he were a stranger to you, and nothing to be made sport of. But on that night I'd known him for 3 years and believed that he was the Son of God. I was his first follower, his best friend, and yet on that night in fear I denied that I knew him 3 times. I think Peter said it to comfort me, and it did a bit, not much. If I'm honest, nothing does very much. You know, I haven't talked about that night for years. Or I think of it often. I dream about it, but I don't often talk about it. It's strange about how talking about it somehow loosens the memory. All sorts of other things come back. As I told you, my feelings of shame about joining in that night didn't begin until some time after. We were a rough lot. We were Roman occupation troops, and we regarded convicted prisoners as fair game. It broke the monotony for us. And so did crucifixion. We didn't like the job, but if we were detailed, that were it. Our duties were clear. There were regulations, a rule book. The crosses were ordered, normally 3 at a time, because normally 3 criminals were done together. There used to be a joke. Made first, I was told, by Pilate. Seems he said, do 'em in 3s, nice company for each other. It's possible he was a cruel, hard man, was Pilate, and his jokes seemed to match. The prisoner had to carry his own cross, or at least drag it, with a crossbar over his shoulder. They were very heavy, them crosses. A long up and down winding route had been worked out so that as many people as possible could see the prisoner and read his crime, written on a board, carried by the lead corporal. Jesus' board just said, King of the Jews. Another of Pilate's jokes. When the Jewish elders asked him to change it, he refused and got very nasty. Jesus was too weary to carry his own cross. Not surprising, given he'd been flogged after death. So we pressed into service a man in the crowd. It were regulations he couldn't refuse. There were regulations for everything. The distance apart of the crossing, the nailing of the hands and feet, the periods of watch, the crowd control, everything. There are also certain perks, I suppose. Extra pay, extra drink rations. It could be a bloody business, that nailing part. And the extra leave the following week, well, that were good. And we were entitled to the clothes and possessions of the prisoners. We'd settle on who got what by casting lots, gambling. Well, Jesus had no possessions, and his clothes and his sandals were poor stuff. We did better at the 2 criminals we hung with him. They made a lot of noise, those 2, shouting and screaming, sometimes sensibly, sometimes like crazy or drunk men. And there were always women who offered drugged wine to those on the cross, like Sisters of Mercy. That was allowed in the regulations. Jesus refused. He didn't say much. At one point, I think he said a few words of comfort to the fellow on his left, and there were some women a little way off who seemed to know him. None of his followers or disciples were there. They were all lying low in hiding out of sight. We put the 3 prisoners up at 9 in the morning. Fine, sunny morning. But at noon, the sun went in, and it got darker and darker. Very still and close. It was most unusual, frightening. Never known it before or since. About 3 o'clock, all 3 had been quiet for a while. They'd been up there for 6 hours. And suddenly Jesus raised his head and looked up into the sky. I was quite near. And then he shouted at the top of his voice. His face was alight, his voice and his body full of power. It was impossible. The crowd in the weird twilight was scared and nervous. My mates moved in a bit. And then Jesus shouted again, with the same lift of the head and the same power. It is finished! He died magnificently. Never seen anything like it. One of the things that got him hung was saying he was the Son of God. But you know, at that moment, I knew he was. And I've known that ever since.